Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Chapter 7. The Boggart in the Wardrobe. Malfoy failed to reappear in instructions till late on Thursday morning, when the Slytherins and Gryffindors had been midway through double potions. He swaggered into the dungeon, his proper arm included in bandages and bound up in a sling, performing, in Harry's opinion, as although he were the heroic survivor of some dreadful warfare. "How is it, Draco?" simpered Pansy Parkinson. "Does it harm a lot?" "Yeah," stated Malfoy, putting on a brave form of grimace. But Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy had looked away. calm down," said Professor Snape idly. Harry and Ron scowled at every different. Snape wouldn't have said settle down in the event that they'd walked in past due, he'd have given them detention. However, Malfoy had always been capable of break out with something in Snape's classes. Snape turned into head of Slytherin House, and generality preferred his very own students, principally others. They have been making a brand new potion these days, a shrinking solution. Malfoy installation. His cauldron proper, subsequent to Harry and Ron, so that they have been making ready their elements at the equal table. "Sir," Malfoy known as, "Sir, I will need assist cutting up those daisy roots, due to my arm." "Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him," stated Snape, without looking up. Ron went brick purple. "There may be nothing incorrect along with your arm," he hissed at Malfoy. Malfoy smirked across the table. "Weasley, you heard Professor Snape, split these roots." Ron seized his knife, pulled Malfoy's roots toward him, and started out to chop them more or less, so they had been all one-of-a-kind sizes. "Professor," drawled Malfoy, "Weasley's mutilating my roots, take a seat." Snape approached their table, stared down his hooked nose on the roots, then gave Ron an ugly smile from below his lengthy, greasy black hair. "Exchange roots with Malfoy, Weasley. However, sit down." Ron had spent the final region of an hour cautiously shredding his personal roots into precisely identical pieces. "Now," said Snape in his most dangerous voice. Ron shoved his own beautifully cut roots throughout the table. Malfoy then took up the knife again. "And, sir, I will need this shrivelfig skinned," stated Malfoy, his voice complete of malicious laughter. "Potter, you can skin Malfoy's shrivelfig," stated Snape, giving Harry the look of loathing he always reserved just for him. Harry took Malfoy's shrivelfig as Ron started trying to restore the harm to the roots he now had to use. Harry skinned the shrivelfig as speedy as he ought to and flung it lower back across the table at Malfoy without speak me. Malfoy became smirking more widely than ever. "Senior Buddy Hagrid these days," he requested them quietly. "None of your enterprise," stated Ron jerkily, without looking up. "I am afraid he may not be an instructor an awful lot longer," said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow. "Father's no longer very happy about my harm." "Hold speaking, Malfoy, and I will come up with a real injury," tousled Ron. "He has complained to the school governors and to the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a variety of influence, you realize. And a long-lasting injury like this," he gave a big, faux sigh. "Who is aware of if my arm'll ever be the identical again?" "So it really is why you're placing it on," said Harry, by accident beheading a lifeless caterpillar, because his hand turned into shaking in anger. "To try and get Hagrid fired." "Properly," stated Malfoy, reducing his voice to a whisper, "partially, Potter. But there are different blessings too. Weasley, slice my caterpillars for me." Some cauldrons away, Neville changed into in trouble. Neville regularly went to portions and potions instructions. It was his worst problem, and his great worry. Of Professor Snape made matters 10 times worse. His potion, which became imagined to be a bright, acid green, had become "orange, Longbottom," stated Snape, ladling some up and allowing to splash back into the cauldron, so that everybody ought to see. "Orange." Tell me, boy, does anything penetrate that thick skull of yours? Failed to you pay attention me say, quite surely, that best one, tat spleen. Changed into wished? Failed to I country plainly that a dash of leech juice might suffice? What do I should do to make you understand, Longbottom? Neville turned into crimson and trembling. He seemed as although he became on the verge of tears. Please, sir, stated Hermione, please, I could assist. Neville placed it proper. I don't recall asking you to expose omit Granger, stated Snape coldly, and Hermione went as purple as Neville. Longbottom, on the stop of this lesson, we can feed a few drops of this potion in your toad and spot. What happens? Possibly a good way to inspire you to do it well. Snape moved away, leaving Neville breathless with worry. Assist me, he moaned to Hermione. What's up, Harry, stated Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to borrow Harry's brass scales. Have you heard? Everyday profit this morning, they reckon. Sirius Black's been sighted. Where? Said Harry and Ron, quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening carefully. No longer too a long way from here, said Seamus, who appeared excited. It became a muggle who saw him direction she did not certainly understand. The muggles assume he is simply an everyday criminal, don't they? So she phoned the cell phone warm line. By the point the Ministry of Magic were given there, he become gone, not to some distance from here. Ron repeated, searching significantly at Harry. He turned round and saw Malfoy watching carefully. What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned? But Malfoy's eyes were shining malevolently, and that they have been constant. Harry. He leaned across the desk. Black unmarried-handed, Potter, thinking of seeking to trap. Yeah, it truly is right, stated Harry offhandedly. Malfoy's skinny mouth turned into curving in a mean smile. Of direction, if it was me, he said quietly, I would have carried out something. Before now. I wouldn't be staying in college like a terrific boy, I would be out. They're seeking out him. What are you speaking approximately, Malfoy, stated Ron more or less. Don't you know, Potter, breathed Malfoy, his pate eyes narrowed. Understand what? Malfoy let loose a low, sneering snort. Perhaps you'll alternatively now not hazard your neck, he said. Need to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I might want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself. What are you talking approximately, said Harry angrily, but at that second. Snape referred to as, you must have completed adding your substances by now. This potion desires to stew before it could be inebriated, so clear away at the same time as it simmers, and then we'll take a look at Longbottom's. Crabbe and Goyle laughed brazenly, watching Neville sweat as he stirred his potion feverishly. Hermione turned into muttering commands to him out of the corner of her mouth, so that Snape would not see. Harry and Ron packed away their unused ingredients and went to scrub their arms and ladles inside the stone basin within the corner. What did Malfoy suggest? Harry muttered to Ron as he stuck his hands under the icy jet that poured from the gargoyle's mouth. Why could I want revenge on Black? He hasn't executed something to me yet, he's making it up, said Ron savagely. He is looking to make you do something stupid. The end of the lesson in sight, Snape strode over to Neville, who changed into cowering by means of his cauldron. Anyone acquire spherical, stated Snape, his black eyes glittering, and watch what occurs to Longbottom's toad. If he has managed to provide a shrinking answer, it will decrease to a tadpole. If, as I do not doubt, he has finished it wrong, his toad is possibly to be poisoned. The Gryffindors watched fearfully. The Slytherins regarded excited. Snape picked up Trevor the Toad in his left hand and dipped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which became now green. He trickled some drops down Trevor's throat. There has been a second of hushed silence, wherein Trevor gulped, then there was a small pop, and Trevor, the tadpole, became wriggling in Snape's palm. The Gryffindors burst into applause. Snape, looking bitter, pulled a small bottle from the pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on pinnacle of Trevor, and he reappeared unexpectedly, fully grown. 5 factors from Gryffindor, stated Snape, which wiped the smiles from every face. I instructed you no longer to assist him, leave out Granger. Elegance dismissed. Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the stairs to the doorway corridor. Harry turned into still considering what Malfoy had said, at the same time as Ron became seething about Snape. 5 points from Gryffindor, due to the fact the potion become all proper. Why did not you lie, Hermione? You have to be, said Neville did all of it by using himself. Hermione failed to answer. Ron regarded around. In which is she? Harry turned too. They were on the pinnacle of the steps now, looking the relaxation of the elegance past them, heading for the fantastic corridor and lunch. She changed into proper in the back of us, stated Ron, frowning. Malfoy passed them, on foot, between Crabbe and Goyle. He smirked at Harry and disappeared. There she is, said Harry. Hermione changed into panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs, one hand clutched her bag, the opposite seemed to be tucking something down the front of her robes. How did you do that, stated Ron. What, stated Hermione, joining them. 1 minute you had been proper at the back of us, the subsequent moment, you were lower back at the bottom of the stairs once more. What? Hermione seemed barely pressured. Oh, I needed to go lower back for something. Oh no. A seam had cut up on Hermione's bag. Harry wasn't surprised, he ought to see that it became filled with at least a dozen big and heavy books. Why are you sporting these kinds of round with you? Ron asked her. You already know how many subjects I'm taking, said Hermione breathlessly. Couldn't maintain these for me, may want to you? But Ron turned into turning over the books she had handed him, looking at the covers. You haven't were given any of those subjects today. It's best, protection against the dark arts this afternoon. Oh sure, said Hermione vaguely, however she packed all the books lower back into her bag just the identical. I hope there's something appropriate for lunch, I am ravenous, she delivered, and he or she marched off in the direction of the top-notch hall. Do you get the feeling Hermione's no longer telling us something? Ron requested. Harry. Professor Lupin wasn't there when they arrived at his first defense against the darkish arts lesson. All of them sat down, took out their books, quills, and parchment, and were talking when he sooner or later entered the room. Lupin smiled vaguely and positioned his tatty old briefcase on the instructor's desk. He turned into as shabby as ever, however looked healthier than he had at the educate, as although he had had some square meals. Good afternoon, he said. Might you please put all your books back in your baggage? Modern day might be a realistic lesson. You will need handiest your wands. Some curious appears had been exchanged as the class put away their books. They'd by no means had a practical defense towards the darkish arts before, until you counted the memorable class remaining 12 months while their antique teacher had delivered a cageful of pixies to elegance and set them loose. Right then, stated Professor Lupin, while everyone became geared up. If you'd observe me. Perplexed but involved, the class got to its feet and followed Professor Lupin out of the classroom. He led them along the abandoned corridor and round a nook, where the primary component they saw turned into Peeves the poltergeist, who changed into floating the other way up in midair and stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum. Peeves failed to look up till Professor Lupin became 2 feet away. Chook he wiggled his curly-toed toes and broke into track. Loony, loopy Lupin, Peeves saying. Loony, crazy Lupin, loony, crazy Lupin. Rude and unmanageable as he nearly always was, Peeves typically showed a few admire towards the academics. All people looked speedy at Professor Lupin to see how he would take this. To their marvel, he turned into nonetheless. Smiling, "I might take that gum out of the keyhole if I had been you, Peeves," he stated pleasantly. "Mr. Filch won't be capable of get into his brooms." Filch changed into the Hogwarts caretaker, a awful-tempered, failed wizard who waged a constant battle towards the scholars and, certainly, Peeves. However, Peeves paid no interest to Professor Lupin's words, besides to blow a loud wet raspberry. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. "This is a useful little spell," he instructed the elegants over his shoulder. "Please watch carefully." He raised the wand to shoulder height, said "Wadawasi," and pointed it at Peeves. With the pressure of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and directly down Peeves' left nose. He whirled upright and zoomed away, cursing. "Cool, sit down," stated Dean Thomas in amazement. "Thank you, Dean," stated Professor Lupin, putting his wand away once more. "We could proceed?" They spark off once more, the magnificence looking at shabby Professor Lupin with multiplied admire. He led them down a second corridor and stopped, right outside the staffroom door. "Interior, please," said Professor Lupin, beginning it and status lower back. The staffroom, a protracted, paneled room complete of antique, mismatched chairs, changed into empty except for one instructor. Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair, and he looked around because the elegants filed in. His eyes had been glittering and there was an unpleasant sneer playing around his mouth. As Professor Lupin came in and made to shut the door behind him, Snape said, "Go away it open, Lupin. I would as a substitute no longer witness this." He got to his feet and strode beyond the class, his black gowns billowing behind him. At the entrance he grew to become on his heel and stated, "In all likelihood no one's warned you, Lupin, however this elegance contains Neville Longbottom. I might recommend you not to entrust him with something hard. No longer unless leave out Granger is hissing commands in his ear." Neville went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape, it changed into horrific, sufficient that he bullied Neville in his own training, not to mention doing it in front of different teachers. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. "I used to be hoping that Neville could help me with the first stage of the operation," he stated, "and I'm positive he's going to carry out it admirably." Neville's face went, if viable, even redder. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now, then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the elegants towards the give-up of the room, in which there was nothing but an vintage cloth wardrobe in which the lecturers kept their spare gowns. As Professor Lupin went to stand subsequent to it, the wardrobe gave a surprising wobble, banging off the wall. "Not anything to worry approximately," stated Professor Lupin flippantly, due to the fact a few human beings had jumped backward in alarm. "There is a Boggart in there." The general public seemed to sense that this became something to fear about. Neville gave Professor Lupin a glance of natural terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Boggarts like dark, enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gap below beds, the cupboards underneath sinks. I've even met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in the previous day afternoon, and that I asked the headmaster if the personnel would go away it to provide my 1/3 year's some practice. So, the first question we ought to ask ourselves is, what is a Boggart?" Hermione placed up her hand. "It's a shapeshifter," she stated. "It may take the form of something it thinks will frighten us maximum." "Couldn't have placed it higher myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. "So the Boggart sitting inside the darkness within has not yet assumed a shape. He does now not yet know what's going to frighten the individual on the other side of the door." Nobody is aware of what a boggart looks like whilst he is by myself, however after I let him out, he will at once become anything. Each folks maximum fears this means, stated Professor Lupin, deciding on to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, that we've a big gain over the boggart. Earlier than we begin. Have you ever spotted it, Harry? Trying to answer a query with Hermione next to him, springing up and down on the balls of her toes along with her hand inside the air, turned into very offsetting, but Harry had a pass. Air, because there are so many of us, it won't realize what form it need to be? Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione placed her hand down, searching a bit dissatisfied. It is usually exceptional to have company while you're coping with a boggart. He turns into confused. Which need to he end up, a headless corpse or a flesh-consuming slug? I as soon as noticed a boggart make that very mistake, tried to frighten two human beings without delay, and turned himself into half a slug. No longer remotely horrifying. The appeal that repels a boggart is easy, yet it requires force of thoughts. You see, the thing that actually finishes a boggart is laughter. What you want to do is pressure it to anticipate a form which you find a laugh. We can exercise the allure without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, said the elegants together. Good, stated Professor Lupin. Superb, but that became the smooth part, I am afraid. You spot, the phrase alone isn't sufficient. And this is where you are available in, Neville. The wardrobe shook again, although now not as lots as Neville, who walked forward as though he had been heading for the gallows. Proper, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first, what could you say is the thing that frightens you most within the world? Neville's lips moved, however no noise got here out. Did not catch that, Neville, sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville regarded round rather wildly, as even though begging a person to help him, then stated, in slightly more than a whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly all people laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, but, regarded considerate. Professor Snape, Neville, I consider you stay with your grandmother? Yes, said Neville nervously. However, I don't want the boggart to become her both. No, no, you misunderstand me, stated Professor Lupin, now smiling. I marvel, could you inform us what kind of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville regarded startled, but stated, nicely, always the same hat. A tall one with a stuffed vulture on top. And a long get-dressed, green, normally, and now, and again a fox fur scarf. And a handbag, induced Professor Lupin. A massive pink one, stated Neville. Proper then, said Professor Lupin. Are you able to photo the one's clothes very? Without a doubt, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes, stated Neville uncertainty. It seems that questioning what changed into coming subsequent, whilst the boggart bursts out of this cloth wardrobe, Neville, and sees you, it will anticipate the shape of Professor Snape, stated Lupin. And you will raise your wand thus, and cry ridiculous, and pay attention difficult on your grandmother's clothes. If all is going nicely, Professor Boggart Snape could be forced into that vulture-topped hat, and that green dress, with that big purple handbag. There was a first-rate shout of laughter. The cloth wardrobe wobbled greater violently. If Neville is successful, the boggart is probably to shift his interest to each people in turn, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a second now to consider the issue that scares you most, and consider how you may force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Harry notion. What scared him most inside the global? His first concept changed into Lord Voldemort, a Voldemort again to full power. However, before he had even started to plan a possible Counterattack on a Boggart Voldemort, a horrible picture got here floating too. The surface of his mind, a rotting, glistening hand, slithering back underneath a black cloak, a long, damp breath from an unseen mouth, then a chilly so penetrating. It felt like drowning. Harry shivered, then regarded round, hoping no person had observed. Many humans had their eyes closed tight. Ron was muttering to himself, "Take its legs off." Harry turned into certain he knew what that become about. Ron's greatest worry changed into spiders. "Everybody ready?" stated Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of worry. He wasn't prepared. How should you make a Dementor much less frightening? But he did not want to ask for extra time. Everyone else began nodding and rolling up their sleeves. "Neville, we are going to again away," stated Professor Lupin. "Permit you to have a clear area, all right? I'll call the subsequent man or woman forward. Everybody again, now, so Neville can get a clear shot." All of them retreated, backed against the partitions, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He seemed pale and anxious, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his gowns and became preserving his wand ready. "At the B counted of 3, Neville," said Professor Lupin, who changed into pointing his own wand on the deal with of the cloth cabinet. 1 3. Now. A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The cloth cabinet burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville sponsored away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down upon him, achieving inside his robes. Are ridiculous," squeaked Neville. "There has been a noise like a whip crack." Snape stumbled. He changed into wearing a lengthy, lace-trimmed get-dressed and a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and he changed into swinging a large crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter. The Boggart paused, burdened, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati! Ahead!" Parvati walked ahead, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There has been every other crack, and where he had stood changed into a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face became to Parvati, and it began to stroll towards her very slowly, dragging its FT, its stiff arms rising. "Ridiculous," cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled on the mummy's FT, it became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. "Seamus," roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted beyond Parvati. Crack! In which the mum was a girl with floor-length black hair and a skeletal, inexperienced tinged face, a banshee. She opened her mouth wide and an unearthly sound crammed the room, a long, wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on. "Give up, ridiculous," shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat, her voice turned into gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle, then, crack, had become a rattlesnake, which slithered and writhed earlier than crack, turning into an unmarried, bloody eyeball. "It's burdened," shouted Lupin. "We are getting there." Dean hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and started to creep alongside the ground like a crab. "Ridiculous," yelled Dean. "There has been a snap, and the hand turned into trapped in a mousetrap." "Super. Ron, you subsequent." Ron leapt ahead. Crack! Quite a few human beings screamed. A massive spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, turned into advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. For a moment, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, ridiculous, bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished. It rolled again and again, Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way, and it got here to a halt at Harry's toes. He raised his wand, equipped, however. "Here," shouted Professor Lupin, suddenly, hurrying ahead. Crack! The legless spider had vanished. For a second, all and sundry regarded wildly around to see wherein it was. Then they noticed a silvery white orb hanging in the air in the front of Lupin, who said, ridiculous, almost lazily. Crack. Ahead, Neville, and finish him off, said Lupin, because the Boggart landed at the ground as a cockroach. Crack. Snape was returned. This time Neville charged ahead, searching, decided. Ridiculous, he shouted, and that they had a split-second's view of Snape in his lacy dress before Neville let out a great ha of laughter, and the Boggart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and become long past. Extremely good, cried Professor Lupin as the magnificence broke into applause. Exquisite, Neville. Properly achieved, every person. Allow me see, 5 factors. To Gryffindor, for all and sundry, to address the Boggart, 10 for Neville. Because he did it twice, and 5 each, to Hermione and Harry. But I did not do something, said Harry. You and Hermione responded my questions successfully at the begin of the magnificence, Harry, Lupin said gently. Thoroughly, every person, and super. Lesson. Homework, kindly read the bankruptcy on Boggarts and summarize it. For me, to be surpassed in on Monday. In order to be all, speak me excitedly, the elegance left the staff room. Harry, however, wasn't feeling pleased. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped him from tackling the Boggart. Why? Because he'd seen Harry fall apart on the train, and idea he wasn't up to plenty? Had he notion Harry could bypass out once more? But no one else seemed to have observed something. Did you spot me take that banshee? Shouted Seamus. And the hand, stated Dean, waving his personal round. And Snape in that hat. And my mummy, I ponder why Professor Lupin's afraid of crystal balls, stated Lavender thoughtfully. That changed into the best protection in opposition to the darkish arts lesson we've ever had, wasn't it? Stated Ron excitedly as they made their manner back to the lecture room to get their luggage. He seems like an excellent teacher, said Hermione approvingly. But I should have had a turn with the Boggart. What would it have been for you? Said Ron, sniggering. A piece of homework that best got 9 out of 10?